And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Most of the world was horrified recently by the attack on author Salman Rushdie. As we record this, Salman Rushdie is still in the hospital with extremely grave injuries that have been described as life-changing. He may lose an eye. He has liver damage. He has nerve damage to one arm. It's lucky that he survived it all against a knife-carrying attacker who was clearly determined to inflict death and or extreme harm on Mr. Rushdie. And my next guest, who's a good friend of mine, has been on the program several times before, wrote, I thought, a very good piece about it for a Jacobin magazine. Ben Burgis is a writer and a philosophy professor. He has a couple books out, including Canceling Comedians While the World Burns and Give Them an Argument. He is the host of a Give Them an Argument podcast, and his latest piece is Salman Rushdie's Stabbing Should Remind Us That Free Speech is a Non-Negotiable Progressive Value. So first of all, Ben, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
It's always great talking with you, but even in such a horrific set of circumstances, I guess let me start with this. There's a part of me that thinks, why should you even need to write that, man? I mean, it's like, it should be obvious. I know it isn't. So obviously there's a rhetorical element to my question, but it astonishes me that one would even need to write a piece saying that the left needs to be reminded that free speech is a non-negotiable value. So what was your motivation for writing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have seen, certainly in the last several years, I have talked to way too many radicals who've convinced themselves that free speech is kind of an unserious liberal preoccupation. I've talked to too many radicals or liberals who are so used to only really hearing conservatives talk about free speech that, like, the phrase itself, raises their eyebrows a little bit. That they, I've heard many times this idea that people who are called free speech absolutists, which is a slightly silly phrase, by the way, like almost nobody is actually an absolutist, but what they mean is people who care a lot about free speech and are very and are very suspicious of any attempt to limit it, that are, must just be looking for excuses to express bigotry. I mean, I think that these are kind of depressingly common attitudes. And while I don't think, don't get me wrong, I don't think that there's some contingent of secular progressives who are in favor of stabbing, blasphemous novelists. I do think that the incident is a reminder of maybe what some of the stakes are, and of what of why we care about this value in so much in the first place, or why we should.
Well, it's such a fascinating subject to me, Ben, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that many people who describe themselves as free speech defenders are treated as a relative and not an absolute value themselves. In other words, they are adamant about defending the speech rights of a Salman Rushdie, of who profoundly deserves those speech rights. Don't get me wrong, sure. Or a Charlie Hebdo or someone, sure. But do not maybe this particular group might not feel the same way about the free speech rights of someone who advocates becoming Muslim or becoming a Christian or something. So I think the issue gets muddied on the one hand by people who treat it as almost a bourgeois affectation. It's kind of, a little bit of what you're describing, related to what you're describing, but also by those who really treat it as a way of promoting a set of ideas that they, and perhaps you or I, might be sympathetic with, but that's a kind of relativism too, because a Voltaire, who was no slouch when it came to advocating atheism, Trumpism, who talked about defending to the death your right to say things that he abhorred. So I think that piece gets left off it a lot, and people become free speech defenders when it's a speech they admire. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Totally, yeah. I think I think we have a really recent example of this from a couple days ago, right? So Sam Harris, who's somebody who will certainly talk about free speech in a context like the Rushdie stabbing, kind of infamously went on a podcast and defended Twitter's suppression of the New York Post's story about Hunter Biden's laptop just before the election. Which, I think, and, whatever, I voted the same way that Sam Harris did, but I think that if you actually cared about the principle, right, that should be pretty disturbing, right? That we're stopping, a news organization from spreading a story because, you've decided that it sounds wrong, that sounds wrong
right.
to you. And really because you're afraid that it'll influence the election in the wrong way. So yeah, I think it's the easiest thing in the world to support the free speech of people you agree with, and then it's much more challenging to support the free speech of people you disagree with. But I think the real heart of the issue for me is do you think that everybody should be able to hear it all and make up their own minds, right? Because if you don't, right? Like I actually think, far from free speech being a bourgeois affectation, I actually think that I could have an easier time understanding how a certain kind of like technocratic liberal, right? Your Sam Harris types could end up supporting censorship because, they kind of think, well, they sort of believe in rule by benevolent experts, right?
Right.
We know better. We should be able to tell you what's good and what's good and bad. You should just kind of trust us, right? Like all those people in the previous election before, that one who kept going on and on about how Hillary Clinton was the most competent, qualified candidate who's ever run for president, as if it were this technocratic job interview where you just had to compare CVs. Because that's the conception, is the rule by benevolent experts. Whereas, if you're a radical leftist, right? Then
right.
if you're a socialist, you should believe what CLR James believed, right? That every cook can govern. And if you think, I don't see how you could reconcile that with thinking that we need to make sure that the particularly bad or dangerous, that like we have to pre-select which ideas the cook gets to have access to in the first place.
Right. Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And to me, first of all, I was going to bring up Sam Harris, but not so benevolent a ruler, again, if you're Muslim, because
right.
he certainly was a strong advocate for torture of Middle Easterners. He was certainly, thought it was a pretty good idea to nuke the capitals of Muslim majority countries and so on. But in many cases, people do view themselves as a benevolent elite, sure. But any elite is contrary to the principles of egalitarianism, socialism, democracy with a small d, and so on. So really, Ben, this is such a fascinating topic because we're really at least already talking about three different categories when it comes to the free speech discussion. There's the benevolent or not so benevolent technocratic elite, cadre, right, which is, or a group, which is anybody from Sam Harris to the Twitter executives who censored the New York Post for an absolutely factual article about Hunter Biden's laptop or whatever, what have you, and everybody who's now in the liberal democratic sphere who embraces censoring, views that might endanger democratic election prospects and so on. So you have that sort of technocratic elite anti-free speech movement. You have the cadre of troublemakers like ourselves who believe that free speech is a fundamental leftist principle, as well as, I imagine you agree with me, fundamental moral principle. Yeah. And then you have a third group, which we haven't yet talked about much, which is, as you say, and I don't want to mischaracterize your thinking on it, but a kind of socialist, radical, both of which I think I would embrace as descriptors for myself, but a group that thinks that free speech is, I use the phrase bourgeois affectation, maybe that's too harsh, but lower down on the list of priorities, certainly, than fomenting revolution or major transformation, whereas I see it as inseparable. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on those sort of categorizations?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, certainly historically, it's been seen as inseparable. I mean, you could go back to 1842, and Karl Marx was cutting his teeth writing polemics against Prussian press censorship, and if you read Hal Draper's book on that, he argues that, really in a lot of ways, that was formative in the development of Marx's politics. You can go to this country and see the history of the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, Radical Labor Union, where they'd go to a town to organize, and the sheriff would kick them out, and they'd describe what they were doing as as a free speech fight. That was the phrase. You can go to the late 20th century and look at the beginnings of the New Left, the free speech movement, at Berkeley.
Right.
There is a uninterrupted chain of radical left thought that that does see free speech as a inseparable core value. I mean, you do have I would not deny that there are mutations of that tradition that have gone off in other directions. That's obviously true, right? The Soviet Union existed, et cetera, right? But I think that if you see the point of socialism not just as state ownership, means production, but as radical democracy, right? That's how you understand the point, right? That that the problem. The problem with capitalism is that it's, the sort of most important problem with capitalism is that it's too close to all the systems that came before it, right? That that you still, even if we have some, fig leaf of everybody being, free to make a legal contract and, et cetera, in practice, you still have people who give orders and people who take orders, and the people who take orders, don't really exercise any kind of democratic accountability over the people who give them. If you see that as the core concern, right, then you have to believe that everybody is capable of self government. That everybody's capable of making up their own minds about about how to run things, and not that they'll always make the right decisions, of course, right? Nobody does, but that that you have some fundamental level of trust in the ability of ordinary people to do that, and I just don't see how that can be reconciled with the idea, this sort of rhetoric that we often see now. I think I think there are people who sort of put a revolutionary socialist gloss on it, but I think really it has to do with the liberal side of the day-to-day culture war. That this kind of rhetoric that you see where people, sort of characterize bad and wrong ideas almost like they're like viruses. That we need to contain. That it's like, oh, you can't let the dangerous stuff get out, into the water supply. And that just seems incredibly infantilizing, right? I mean, I think that people, I think that people are basically capable of, I mean, certainly reading novels, that they might find upsetting, without having to be, protected from them, or being exposed to bad or silly or mistaken or whatever, ideas, and sorting it out. I mean, I think that again, there's no guarantee, that the right ones will win, but I mean, if you don't have some basic level of confidence, that you'll be able to, convince people, I don't know what the plan is, for carrying out any kind of social change.
Right, right. No, I think that's exactly right. Interestingly, I hope this isn't a digression, Ben Burgis, but one of the things I thought of when you were speaking was Richard Dawkins inventing the word meme some time ago, not to mean what it popularly means today, but this, I think, specious idea that there was an equivalent of a gene in the human brain and in the world of ideas, and that as he sort of made genes. I mean, I think he was a brilliant explainer of science in many ways, but that he made genes into little cartoon characters competing for dominance. He gave them sort of agency, and then said memes were ideas, and that people were just basically carriers of these memes. Religion was an infectious meme, but somehow, for some reason, atheism wasn't, and I remember all that. And I remember at the time, I wrote a piece called Memes Are Angels for Atheists, basically saying, they're intermediaries. They're, between the non-physical and physical worlds in the minds of some. And I got a lot of comments and emails saying, well, you've just been infected with a meme. So if you believe that, then it's only good public hygiene to prevent infection, right? And totally. I think, in a sense, Dawkins was both patient X for a dangerous idea and basically just a carrier of something that had been in the zeitgeist for a while, which was the idea that people don't really know what to think and you really can't control their own destiny, and in many ways, of course, we know Dawkins is politically progressive. I don't deny that. But the notion that, I would say more authentically so than Sam Harris, for example, but the notion that, although he's become a curmudgeon, but, the notion that, people lack the ability to make their own judgments, to me, is key in this widespread tendency to abandon free speech. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a great connection. I was thinking about the Dawkins meme thing the other day. Which is actually really, there's something deeply strange about the fact that he came up with that, right? Because the whole idea of his point, as I always understood it about genes, is that, well, okay, what is this sort of basic unit of evolutionary selection? We might, normally be tempted to say like traits, but that's really vague. How do you figure out exactly how to draw the boundaries of what counts as as the trait or whatever, and like genes, this is something like really concrete. And then like, surely anything you could say about traits you could say about memes, right? Like whatever those are supposed to be, right? That's and I think it's really an attempt. The whole meme thing, is really an attempt to sort of give this like gloss of scientific precision, to something that was really anything but, right? Dawkins, thinks, Dawkins is an atheist and doesn't, and doesn't like religion and, whatever. And I share a lot of those impulses, but like, but it just sort of pretending that there's something, that you're not just sort of like, tried to figure out what might be true about, about the universe, or you're like sort of expressing some value judgments about like whether
Right.
religion is good or whatever. But, you have to be in that position of like technocratic expertise. Oh, I'm a biologist. You should listen to, to me. Right. I mean, like this is, we were talking about Sam Harris earlier. I mean, this is half of the, this is half of the appeal of Sam Harris, that, even though, hardly anything he says has anything to do with, neuroscience, which is what his training is, but he's just very, very good at sounding like an expert, right? That
Right.
He has that authoritative, calming voice.
Yeah, he had made his name and written his books, and I still claim that anything good you find in, I haven't written anything he's done lately, but in his first 2 books, I still say anything good you find, he stole from Bertrand Harris, usually without Bertrand Russell, usually without attribution. But he made his name before he studied neuroscience. He retrofitted himself to this, in my opinion, to this posture of, I speak for rationality and science, but you wrote a book about Christopher Hitchens. I think to a certain extent, Hitchens was more honest about his biases, but I think he and Hitchens and Dawkins are taking, to a certain extent, set of logical arguments, whether you agree or not, but to a large extent, an aesthetic revulsion toward religious practice. And as I say, retrofitting it with a logical argument. But I don't really think logic or rationality is the motivating force here. I think it's a cudgel to justify just a feeling that it's all disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that like the objection, the sort of main problem that that I have with new atheism is that it kind of, okay, so like the subtitle of Christopher Hitchens' atheism book, which certainly as a book is like better than most of what the rest of those guys wrote, but like is Religion Poisons Everything, and I think I think there's just like a really important sort of baseline sense in which that's just not true, right? That it's that, and that's like saying that's not true isn't even like a particularly like pro-religious statement. That's just a misdiagnosis, right? Of what the the sort of central problem is in the world. That I mean, unjust social structures certainly poison everything, and there are interpretations of religions that are used to justify that, right? But but if you have if you're, I mean, the sort of one of the things when I like read Hitchens on religion, and there's plenty that I like, but I mean but one of the things that always bothers me is there's this sort of sense that it's almost like he agrees with a true believer that there's such a thing as like real Christianity or real Islam or whatever, so that if you have some nice liberal tolerant version, that's not the real one, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's like, well, wait a second though. I mean, if you believe that these are all like messy, historically contingent, man-made, systems, then there is no real version, right? There's just a multiplicity of ways that people have things that different people have gotten out of this sort of text or symbols or whatever over the centuries, and it's all equally real or fake or whatever, and I do think maybe to connect it back to the original subject, that there is a way that like I think Hitchens at his silliest moments, right? And I don't remember if this line is original to Hitchens or to Dawkins, right? But would say things like raising, what is it, like teaching children to believe in hell is child abuse, right?
Right.
And okay, I don't, I dislike, raising children to believe in hell, but like saying it's child abuse is a hell of a claim, right? I mean, because it's like if you really took that seriously, right, then like your ideal world, Child Protective Services would be called to stop anybody from doing that, right? Which I think gets back to the sort of paternalism about ideas, right? That I don't really I don't really care that much, right? I mean, like, maybe on some abstract human level I do, but like, there is a sense in which I don't really care very much what anybody is raised to believe, right? I mean, I care that we have a society where, like, once you become an adult, you can, go your own way, right?
Right.
But like, I don't, because I don't see, because I don't see either religious fundamentalism or any other bad idea really as this kind of infection that needs to be quarantined, right? Like, I think it's fine, right? I mean, I have a like whatever, get them, let people, let people take their kids to, to wherever they want on Friday or Sunday, and then, and then maybe when they turn 19, they can take my intro to philosophy class. I'll take a crack at them, but like, I don't, I'm not worried about that, right? I think that it's completely, I think that within reason, you're not actually abusing people, et cetera, right? That you can kind of let 100 flowers bloom there, and I'm ultimately, pretty confident that in the long run, some kind of like secular multicultural kind of values, are going to win anyway.
It has to do with trust in people, I think, in the end. And that's what you're saying, that the leftism we need is the leftism that believes in people, trusts in people, wants to return, forgive the, well-worn phrase, but wants to return power to the people, or give power to the people in a genuine way. And that's the piece that we've been missing. And interestingly enough, since your subject is Salman Rushdie and free speech as it applies to Rushdie, I've studied Islam a great deal. I speak a tiny little bit of Arabic, but I do know some. And of course read the satanic verses. It's not, Islam is not that it matters if it would. Sure. It could be a polemic, vile, hateful polemic against Islam.
Not.
But if it were, the issue would be the same, right?
Sure.
But of free speech. But it's absolutely, you're right, it's absolutely not. Islam is almost kind of, or the Islamic imagery that's brought into it is almost projections on a screen for characters that are wrestling with issues of neo-colonialism and identity and other subjects that are being dealt with by a really smart, westernized, non-religious leftist intellectual. I mean, that's what the book is to me. And so going back to this concept of mirror images, he became a symbol for the people who were defending him, of this guy who was, attacked Islam. He didn't attack Islam. I think he used it as a kind of set of touch points briefly for his own background. And in fact, what I read in it was a guy kind of carefully trying to avoid being too offensive towards Islam. He used a pejorative nickname for Muhammad, but he didn't use the name Muhammad. He used his wives' names for prostitutes in a brothel, but they weren't his wives. You know what I mean? He was kind of, trying to finesse it. And so his defenders sometimes made him out to be something he wasn't. And of course, the story's out now. Khomeini never read the book, but perhaps he was most angry about the satirization of Khomeini himself. And I also think, as a cynical politician, Khomeini probably saw this as a way to stir up the crowd towards him. A horrid thing to do, but probably what he did. So, but again, in these battles for causes, it seems to me the lesson for us on the left is if we don't keep free speech uppermost in our minds at all times, we'll betray one of our own core values.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think what you say about the novel is right. That that I was talking about this. My college show last night, and the analogy I used, I think, was like, it's like the sense in which people thought it was blasphemous is more like the sense in which some Christians thought the Last Temptation of Christ was blasphemous. Than like it's more like the Last Temptation of Christ than the Piss Christ, right? Let's put it that way.
Right, that's very true. Yeah.
And I agree. I mean, it shouldn't. It shouldn't matter, right? But it is, but I think there might be just a little bit of a sense around the edges that it does matter. Not that it would deserve any sort of less fervent a defense on free speech grounds if it were, on the Piss Christ end of the spectrum. But that they, I think one of the basic questions, about free speech is always, who gets to decide, right? This is, we were criticizing, I think, rightly criticizing, Christopher Hitchens earlier, but I mean, to praise something that he said that I liked. There's a debate that he did on free speech in some university in Canada in the late 2000s, where he has my all-time favorite debate opening, right? Where he starts out by just yelling the word fire and says, okay, now I've said it, right? Let's talk about, and, and he's sort of looking around. It's this, university dining hall. It's like, I haven't said it in a crowded theater, granted, I seem to have said it in the dining hall at Hogwarts, but they have but then he goes into the actual context of that line, right? About how you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, the context. Or if Brandeis saying that was in upholding the conviction of a group of Jewish socialists who had been arrested for distributing anti-war and anti-conscription literature during World War I. This is what was supposed to be yelling fire, in a crowded theater. And of course, as he rightly points out, you could make an excellent case that they were pointing out an actual fire, right?
Right, exactly. Right. What do you do when there's a fire, right?
Exactly. And then the real question is who gets to decide what counts as a real fire, right? In this analogy, and so it's like, okay, even if you think like, oh, if this really were, and I mean, this is one of the things the sort of grumpier things I say in the article, that like one of the things that depresses me thinking about this is that like, if the satanic verses were, that's almost published by some major house now, and they sent it to some, they sent it to Sensitivity Reader. They decided that that it was Islamophobic, it shouldn't be published. It's way too easy to imagine a lot of people I basically agree with politically, sort of like shrugging. Right, about that. It's like, no, that sounds pretty bad to me, right? But I think that's the real question. It's like, well, okay, I mean, the reason why it's maybe important that the satanic verses is not what some people imagine it is, I don't, shouldn't you be able to, like, even on a question like that, right? I mean, if something really is like, hateful and awful, sure, it should be condemned, but I mean, like, you should still be able to read it to decide whether it's hateful and awful, right? I mean, is this really, some sort of extreme Islam bashing or sort of giving offense for the sake of offense or whatever? It's like, well, some people say that. Do I agree with them? I should be able to read the book.
Right. One of the great French writers of the last 150 years, Louis Ferdinand Céline, was a raging anti-Semite. Brilliant prose stylist. As a kid, I could read his writing and understand that his gift was, he wasn't even expressing political opinions, but I could understand that but it bled through, right? I could understand his gift and admire and take pleasure from his gift without becoming an anti-Semite. I didn't need to be protected from Salman. All right. Well, I guess we should wrap up, but I mean, we'll avoid for now anyway, the swamp of where cancel culture fits into all this, but except to say that I think we should be much more willing as a left to not embrace, but to accept views we don't agree with, and maybe beat the hell out of them if we think that's appropriate, but not silence them. So,
I mean, you know what? Like, if Salman Rushdie published a novel that that was just the most awful, the dumbest, most ridiculous novel that ever, and and you found it deeply offensive. I mean, I think a really good response would be to like write a novel where there's like a character who's really obviously supposed to be Salman Rushdie, and and you just like savagely mock him, and whatever. I mean, that's great, right?
Right.
I think that would be the appropriate, level of response to that, right? But I mean, it is kind of, I've got to say, like, I think it sort of maybe shows how deep the rot has gone on some of this stuff that, like, sure, I don't run into a lot of people who say, yeah, absolutely, he should have been stabbed, right? I mean, that would be pretty fringe, but like, I see, but like, people like, well, sure, that's bad, but but maybe he was really trying to be provocative, when he wrote that, and whatever. It's like, no, this should be, we should be able to do this one without hedging, right? I mean, there's this guy, a novelist. And by the way, I think he's like probably, I think he's probably become drifted in the wrong direction to a certain extent politically over the decades for painfully obvious reasons, right?
Right.
But I think that, but if you look at his earlier work, right? I mean, he spoke out about Palestine and Kashmir. He wrote a book about the Sandinistas.
Yes, he did. Yeah. Jaguar or something. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah. That's it. That's the one, right? So so this left wing novelist, wrote a work of fiction that people people found offensive. If there's anything that should be a very easy call, no hedging, no equivocation, that they like that should be like, this is just this is just horrifying, and it's a very simple issue, right? I mean, you can like, if you don't like the book, give it a 1-star review, but they have the fatwa issue should be really simple.
Right. Well, there's so much more we could talk about, but we'll have to leave it there. My guest has been Burgis. The article in Jacobin, which is well worth reading, Salman Rushdie's stabbing, should remind us that free speech is a non-negotiable progressive value. As always, Ben, thanks for the great work. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.